7 F1 drivers that were so bad they'll never be forgotten. Every driver who races in F1 will hope to have success, or at least make a mark on the sport in some way. Unfortunately, some drivers end up being memorable for all the wrong reasons. Fans these days love to hate on the likes of Lance Stroll or Pastor Maldonado for being bad, but compared to some of the drivers in this list, Stroll might as well be Ayrton Senna. These 7 drivers were not only bad, but they had moments that genuinely made you wonder whether it was possible to do a worse job. Yuji Ide. At 31, Ide was quite old for a debutant when he joined the new Super Aguri team for 2006, but he had a decent racing background. Runner-up in the Japanese F3 and the highly competitive Formula Nippon Championship, a race winner in Super GT and French F3, and with a 5th place finish at the Macau GP, Ide obviously had plenty of talent. Unfortunately, none of this seemed to come with him to Formula 1. At the season opener in Bahrain, Ide looked like he was struggling to even keep the car on the track. At one point, he corrected a slide so violently that his hand slipped off the steering wheel. He was almost 3 seconds slower than his teammate Takuma Sato in qualifying and 7 seconds off Michael Schumacher's pace. Amazingly, he made it 33 laps into the race before his engine failed, which maybe was a blessing in disguise. Malaysia was a slight improvement, just 1.7 seconds behind Sato in qualifying, as he again retired with mechanical issues, but he seemed to take a step backwards in Australia. He spun a number of times in practice and became something of an obstacle to other drivers in qualifying, where he was almost 4 seconds slower than Sato. If the 107% rule was around in 2006, he'd have failed to qualify twice. He finally managed to finish a race, however, 13th and last, 3 laps down and a lap behind his teammate. His days were numbered, and the next race at Imola was the last of those numbers. After qualifying 1.6 seconds behind Sato, on the first lap of the race he ploughed into the side of the Midland of Christian Albers, flipping him into the gravel in a spectacular incident. Under the advice of the FIA, Super Aguri dropped Ide, and a few days later the FIA took away Ide's super licence, effectively banning him from Formula 1. Harsh, but probably fair. Taki Inoue. By results alone, Taki Inoue was poor. The qualifying gaps to his teammates were regularly measured in seconds rather than tenths. He only finished 5 of his 18 races, with retirements being a solid mix of spins and mechanical issues. But it's not the lack of speed that makes Inoue's career so legendarily awful. It was the unusual and comical incidents he seemed to find himself involved in. Let me give you a taster. During practice at Monaco, Inoue went off at Mirabeau, stalled the car and had to watch from the sidelines. After the session, he jumped back in and got a tow back to the pits. As this was happening, French rally legend Jean Ragnotti was outspanking one of the course cars around the circuit. As he came through the swimming pool, he spotted Inoue being towed back to the paddock, but it was too late, and Ragnotti slammed into the back of the footwork. Inoue turned the wheel to avoid hitting the truck that was pulling him, causing the rope to effectively flip him upside down. Although Inoue had the presence of mind to keep wearing his helmet, his seatbelts weren't done up. Incredibly, he was okay, a fact he said he realised when his balls moved after the crash. If balls don't move, then there's a problem with brain damage, I think. Amazingly, that wouldn't be his last incident with a course vehicle. After breaking down from 18th place early in the Hungarian GP, Inoue's footwork started to smoke. In an attempt to help out, he grabbed a fire extinguisher from the side of the track, but as he ran back across the grass to his car, he was mown down by a course vehicle that had just arrived on the scene. After rolling across the bonnet, Inoue hopped a couple of times before collapsing on the floor. Apart from a slightly sore leg, he was fine, making the whole thing one of the most comical bloopers in F1 history. To be fair to Inoue, his driving was beginning to improve slightly as the season progressed, but a planned drive with Minardi in 1996 fell through when a sponsor pulled out. He's since embraced his status as a terrible driver, freely admitting that he wasn't good enough for F1 and joking about the unusual incidents that made his career. Jean-Denis Delatraz. "What is Delatraz doing?" A classic line of Murray Walker commentary from the Nürburgring in 1995 that summed up the Swiss driver's brief F1 career. Delatraz drove 3 races in F1, the 1994 Australian GP for Larousse, and the Portuguese and European GPs in 1995 for Pacific, and by all accounts, were rather terrible. In qualifying for Australia, he was 3.2 seconds slower than his teammate, and was a staggering 10 laps down when his gearbox gave out after 56 laps. With the Pacific team also in dire need of cash towards the end of 1995, Delatraz had another chance, but if anything, he was even worse. He was 12 seconds off of the pole time in Portugal and over 5 seconds slower than the next fastest driver. In the race, he was several seconds slower than anyone else, lapped after just 7 laps, and retired after 14 laps with cramp. Yes, you heard that right, cramp. His final outing at the Nürburgring was barely any better. Once again, he was seconds off the pace, and a moment where he weaved across the circuit for no reason prompted Murray to wonder what he was up to. Delatraz at least finished this race, albeit in 15th and last, 7 laps down. And that was it for Delatraz's F1 career. A failed sponsor payment saw him replaced for the rest of the year, while his lack of pace prompted F1 to introduce the 107% qualifying rule. Although his time in F1 was laughable, Delatraz went on to be much more successful in sports cars, twice winning his class at Le Mans. Alpes. Being disqualified from a race is a reasonably uncommon occurrence, and usually only happens because a car has breached technical regulations. Not this time, however. Pease entered his home race 3 times in the late 1960s without success. The last of those occasions in 1969 ended with one of the most unusual and embarrassing disqualifications in F1 history. He was too slow. At the time of the disqualification, Pease had only completed 22 laps of the Canadian Grand Prix, less than half the amount of leader Jackie Stewart. He'd also been something of an obstruction on the track, pushing other cars off the circuit and getting in the way of the leaders. After almost wiping Stewart out of the lead, Ken Tyrrell went to the stewards and demanded Pease be black flagged. The protest worked, and the 48-year-old Canadian became the only person in F1 to be disqualified from a race for driving too slowly. Ricardo Rosset. Rosset's career shouldn't have been as bad as it was. In 1995, he was a runner-up in his debut year in Formula 3000, a forerunner of today's Formula 2, earning him an F1 drive with footwork the following year. Looking at Rosset's efforts in 1998, however, you can see why he's made this list. He failed to qualify for 5 races, while teammate Tora Takagi was more than capable of mixing it with the Minardis, Prosts, Arrows and Stewarts. When he did qualify, he was a lot less incident-prone than he had been in 1996, with one notable exception. Anyone remember the colossal 14-car collision at a wet Spa? Well, it should have only really been a 13-car pile-up, but Rosset, a good few seconds after the bulk of the accident had already happened, ploughed into the carnage at full speed. Yeah, he was that driver. That somehow wasn't the worst moment either. That would be Monaco. In attempting to qualify, which he obviously failed to do, he had an off at Mirabeau. He got going from that, only to have a spin in the second part of the swimming pool. Somehow he not only didn't hit anything, but had kept the engine running, and attempted to do a spin turn to get back pointing the right way. He messed that up too, and ended up stranded on the curb on the inside of the corner at a marshal's post. Embarrassing. Even his own team were fed up with him. After the incident, his mechanics reportedly rearranged the letters of the name on his scooter so that it spelt the word tosser. It must have been an incredibly tough season for Rosset. Struggling enough with your own performance is bad enough, but having a team that clearly didn't want him can't have made it an easy environment to be in. David Walker. The first job any F1 driver has is to beat their teammate. David Walker perhaps knows that better than most, but he was Emerson Fittipaldi's teammate in 1972 when Emo became F1's youngest world champion. Walker, he didn't even score a single point, a unique achievement for a full-time teammate of a world champion. In his 10 races that season, Walker qualified 20th or lower 5 times and had a best grid slot of 12th. Fittipaldi had taken 3 poles and never been lower on the grid than 9th. Things were barely any better in the races either, with a best finish of 9th in Spain. He regularly ended up finishing laps behind his teammate. Of course, it wasn't all as straightforward as Walker simply being bad. Lotus boss Colin Chapman was notorious for putting his focus on a single driver to the detriment of the others, and Walker was no different. It was a vicious cycle. The worse Walker performed, the less attention was placed on him, which made him do worse, and so on. Claudio Langes. There are a ton of drivers from the late 1980s and early 1990s who have strings of failures to qualify for races on the record, many of whom also had experience with the dreaded pre-qualifying. Back then, F1 had so many different teams and drivers that it wouldn't be possible for them all to be accommodated for an entire race weekend. So any new teams or teams that had performed poorly previously had to run the gauntlet of pre-qualifying. Held on the Friday morning before the main practice sessions, the 4 fastest cars would be allowed to take part in the main qualifying session, while everyone else's weekend would be over before it even started. Claudio Langes' entire F1 career consisted of only pre-qualifying sessions. He was hopelessly slow at all 14 events. He was always faster than the drivers from the Life team, but that car was so bad that it would have struggled to compete in F3000, let alone F1. If you ignore Life and occasionally the similarly terrible Subaru-powered Coloni, Langes was always the slowest driver in pre-qualifying by a significant margin. His average deficit to teammate Roberto Moreno was 5.7 seconds. Yeah, you heard me right. The team collapsed with 2 races left to run in the season, taking Lange's career, if you can call it that, with it. Lange holds the unenviable record of the most race entries without ever managing to start one. Have we missed out any drivers that you would put in this list? Let us know in the comment section below.